Thanks for joining us today for Jennifer Strauss and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we have been moving sequentially. And we started with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and they are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on a couple of the slides of the presentation today. And a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the link provided to explore what PTACs can offer. Set Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources, sought, and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. And please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. You can contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on your screen if you do have any questions. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now get in front of your federal humans sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt and Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit growfedbiz.com today. If you're interested in selling to the federal government, you may need a contract vehicle. The most popular one is a GSA schedule, and you can learn about the requirements, the proposal process, and how this contract vehicle may or may not be the right tool for you. Jennifer Strauss is teaching a series of classes, as you can see here, and all classes are listed on our website under the events section with the registration link. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we're holding this year. We've launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe, and this is a live webinar series held each month, and they will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. And we have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topic listed here on your screen, and then take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, our panelists covered subcontracting this month, and next month on June 11th, our panelists will be covering sales and capture. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. You can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. And also, please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Alex Gorlick. Welcome. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Hunter, and thanks for having me. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, so to speak, I just wanted to give you guys a little introduction about who I am and why I'm talking to you today. So I'm an associate at the law firm of Smith, Kern, Hancock here in Washington, D.C. My background is in the world of government contracting. I've spent over a decade in government contracting so far. I started out as a contract specialist and eventually contracting officer for the Department of the Navy, and now I advise federal contractors on the private side on various regulations issues that come up in the sector, bid protests, terminations, and certified claims, among other things. So if we can get into the next slide, and we can start talking about DFARS Part 223. So why are we here, and why do these environmental and safety regulations in DFARS Part 223 matter? In large part, if we skip to the next slide, in large part, these regulations exist to address various safety impacts, and as we go through, we'll take a look at several important clauses, such as the hazard warning labels, safety precautions for ammunition and explosives, drug-free workforce, the prohibitions on storage, treatment, and disposal of toxic or hazardous materials, and the prohibition on hexavalent chromium. Now, keep in mind that as we discuss these clauses and the major requirements, none of the clauses are going to be reproduced in full, and the key to really understanding these clauses is to actually read them and to interpret the language within your contract. So in a lot of these cases, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're interacting closely with your counsel, both throughout the procurement, both pre-award and post, particularly because with many of these environmental clauses, even with the smallest contracts, is where you'll see some of the largest liability and exposure, because exposure is just not proportional to contract value with some of these statutory requirements. So if we go to the next slide. So as I kind of hinted, the whole intent of DFARS Part 223 is really to avoid situations like you see talked about here in this Guardian article. And essentially, the story discusses the fact that certain DoD installations and contractors have been using a particular chemical, aqueous film-forming foam, which is classified as a forever chemical, and has recently come up on the radar as having risks to human health. If any of you have actually seen the recent movie Dark Water with Mark Ruffalo, which is really good, it actually talks about the litigation relating to this chemical and how it can come up and the kind of impact that it can have on livestock. So the whole point of these DFARS Part 223 regulations is literally to prevent issues like this coming up and to minimize the impact and the liability for, frankly, the DoD when they do happen. That's why compliance with the regulations in these sections can really be very significant. The obligations can be quite significant and are so important for contractors and the government as they're both planning and completing these projects. It is always a good idea to kind of start thinking about these requirements early, even when you're in the initial planning stages, because failure to do so really can result in regulatory action, increased costs, delays, and frankly, costly litigation. So as we go through, we'll talk about some of the most commonly encountered obligations in the DFARS Part 223 and try to understand the impact that they may have on your business, and how you can try to avoid and reduce potential problems from these clauses. So if we go through to the next slide. So the first clause and impact that we'll talk about has to do with the hazard warning labels. If we go to the next slide. As you can see, the DFARS requirements in this section are pretty simple. The focus really is on making sure that the contractor simply provides the required hazard warning labels and that those are passed on to the right point of contact within the DoD, specifically the cognizant safety officer. And the DFARS requires these hazard warning labels for pretty much all contracts where one would typically submit hazardous material data sheets, as what they're called, based on the FAR. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll notice that, of course, such data sheets are a requirement whenever supplies being acquired are identified as hazardous materials. And frequently, the way that determination is made is based on this federal standard number 313, the Material Safety Data Sheet, that is actually put out by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If we go to the next slide, you can actually take a look and see some of the factors, some of the things that sort of fall in to those hazardous materials. And of course, the definition is extremely broad. I mean, it captures, it's really meant to capture any item or chemical, which is either a health hazard or physical hazard. So it's carcinogens, it's anything that can damage, any substance that can damage a person's lungs, skin, eyes, and so on. It's various chemicals, it's explosives, flammable materials, nuclear and radioactive materials, and as you'll see there in the third section, I mean, it's really even, there's even like a catch-all that sort of captures everything that doesn't fit these criteria explicitly, but if it produces gases, fumes, smoke, and so on, with those potential characteristics, it will still qualify as a hazardous material. If we go to the next slide. So when you have those criteria, when your material or item falls into one of those categories, is when the FAR would typically require you to provide a hazardous material data sheet. Under the DFARS, you will at this point also be required to provide a hazardous warning label on the item package, on the unit container of any hazardous material that you're delivering under the contract, except, and there are a few exceptions, except those materials that are regulated under certain other statutes, which you see reproduced here. It's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, the Consumer Product Safety Act, the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, or the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. But materials and items under those statutes excluded, everything else really has to have a hazardous warning label. If you do believe that, if contractors do believe that one of those statutory exceptions applies, they actually have to list out and provide the government with a list of all the materials that they believe are subject to those exceptions. For everything else that isn't subject to those exceptions, a contractor, once they learn that they're an apparently successful offer, must submit to the government before award a copy of the hazard warning labels for all the hazardous material that they will be providing. And of course, they also have to make sure that they comply with other requirements for shipment and storage of such hazardous material. This is a key requirement. Obviously, it's there to make sure that you are and everyone is aware of hazardous materials when they are being provided, and no one is moving things around without recognizing the risk associated with those items. If we look at the next page, we'll actually see what some of those hazardous warning labels may look like, and you'll see how they also capture a lot of the categories that we kind of talked about. It's anything that's flammable. It's things that may explode. Pretty much anything that has a risk to someone's health or physical being will be on this list. And the intent is, of course, to have these very basic hazardous labels to make sure that that everyone can read them and understand them without, specific education to interpret them. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a bit about the safety precautions for ammunition and explosives. Let's move on to the next slide. It goes without saying that the DoD takes substantial precautions with regard to handling ammunition and explosives. Frankly, we could spend a whole day just talking about these requirements, but I will save you all that excitement. The key thing to really understand about the requirements for ammunition and explosives is that the DoD's focus really is on taking reasonable precautions to minimize the potential for mishaps. In fact, the DoD has a specific safety manual, the DoD's Contractor's Safety Manual for Ammunition and Explosives, aptly named DoD 4145.26-M, that contains all of the requirements for the contractors to maintain safety of these items. The DoD will incorporate this manual into the contract whenever such items are a part of the contract. But sometimes you'll notice that the DoD will also supplement or replace the safety manual with additional regulations specific to certain DoD components or even installations. If that is the case, however, you really, the only way to find that out primarily is really, you got to read your contract. The general rule of reading your solicitations, reading your contract is always still the key. If we go forward to the next slide. In any case, what you should really remember is to treat the contract requirements, whether that's the DoD's Contractor Safety Manual alone, or the DoD Safety Manual and certain installation-specific regulations. Those need to be your Bible for any job that involves ammunition and explosives. Keep in mind that the relevant version of the safety manual for your project will almost always be the one that is in effect on the date that the solicitation goes out. But again, to really know what applies, what safety precautions for ammunition and explosives apply to your contract, you got to read the contract. The DFARS, in general, will mandate that the contractor also allow the government access to the contractor's facilities, personnel and safety program documentation. The intention of this requirement is obviously to allow the government to evaluate safety programs and implementation in facilities to make sure that everything is compliant with the safety manual and other safety requirements throughout the project. Of course, contractors must also resolve and report any non-compliances with the manual when they do arise. And if there are any mishaps that involve ammunition or explosives, contractors must report and investigate those as well. As you can imagine, ammunition and explosives are frequently a concern, and when issues do arise with such items, it's certainly something that can cause a lot of liability. I cannot stress this enough, but having educated counsel involved in dealing with whatever issues arise with such requirements is really going to make a lot of the difference. And that is true both for the contractors and government personnel listening in. Contracting officers should always stay on top of these issues, and frankly, any environmental issues that we'll talk about or chemical issues that we'll talk about, at the very least, they need to be aware of all communications that occur between the contractor and other regulators about this area. Although, of course, how much that is feasible will depend on each unique situation. Let's go forward to the next slide. So we'll talk a bit about the drug-free workforce. If you go to the next slide, you probably know that the DoD has a policy that seeks to ensure that its contractors maintain a program for achieving a drug-free workforce. This has gotten a lot of talk in recent years, but the DFARS requirements really apply to particular contracts, not all contracts. The focus really is on contracts involving classified work or situations where the contracting officers determine that the drug-free policies are necessary for national security or protecting the health and safety of those affected by the product or the performance of the contract. These drug-free policies from the DoD do not apply to commercial items. They won't apply to most contracts where the performance occurs outside of the United States, and will typically be excluded from contracts that are at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. As we go to the next slide, you may be aware, of course, that the DFARS, and frankly should be, that the DFARS merely supplements the requirements for the drug-free workplace that are part of the FAR. In fact, the FAR has much more extensive requirements on the subject area and obligations for contractors, which include the need to publish and disseminate statements informing employees that unlawful manufacture, distribution, possession, and use of substances is prohibited in the contractor's workplace. And it also is there to specify actions that will be taken against employees for violating the prohibition. Notice that the requirement really is limited to the prohibition in the contractor's workplace, not necessarily outside of the contractor's workplace. But the FAR does also require that the contractors establish a drug-free awareness program, that they notify employees that the prohibition on drugs is a condition of their continued employment, and the FAR will contain certain requirements for instances when employees are convicted under criminal drug statutes for violations occurring in the workplace. In short, the FAR is very explicit that it requires a good faith effort from contractors to maintain a drug-free workplace. If we go to the next slide, we can take a look at the way the DoD requirements supplement that. The DFARS adds just a few particular requirements for the classified programs and those affecting national security and health and safety of users. As we talked about, contractors must institute and maintain a program for achieving the objective of a drug-free workplace. So similar to the FAR requirement, but a little bit more specific, the DFARS actually contains several requirements that the contractors must follow or provide, and this is a crucial part, a contractor can provide appropriate alternatives. So, not necessarily as prescriptive. Some of those requirements for the drug-free program are that there must be an employee assistance program, emphasizing counseling, rehabilitation with available community resources for drug-free purposes. There must be supervisory training to assist in identifying and addressing illegal drug use by contractor employees. There also has to be provision for self-referrals as well as supervisory referrals to treatment for individuals where those issues do occur, and a provision for identifying illegal drug users, including testing on controlled and carefully monitored basis. Now, that testing requirement, is certainly one that comes up a lot. If we go to the next slide, the key really is for contractors to adopt appropriate personnel procedures to deal with employees who are found to be using drugs illegally. Contractors shall also not allow any employee to remain on duty or perform in a sensitive position who are found to use illegal drugs unless and until such time that they are able to determine that the employee may perform in such position competently. But ultimately, let's go to the next slide. what happens when we have employees, where that end up, coming up on the radar of these drug-free policies. You may remember this. This is obviously Elon Musk. A photo from his appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast in 2018, which included this memorable moment. And while this kind of sticks out in everyone's memory, what Musk, of course, is a CEO among his many ventures of a company called SpaceX, which is working, among other things, on developing spacecraft for the government. And what some may not remember is that after this appearance on the podcast and this scene where he was smoking marijuana, the DoD and the NASA actually had significant concerns about the fact that there are drug-free policies that SpaceX must follow as part of their contracts with the government, and that such episodes do not certainly comport with. For example, in this case, NASA actually ordered SpaceX to conduct a $5 million workplace culture review, partially because of their desire to make sure that SpaceX employees were following strict guidelines for federal contractors barring illegal drug use. Individually, Elon Musk actually also had his own issues because the Air Force placed his security clearance under their review following this episode, and ultimately resulted in having to resubmit his SF-86 forms and presumably undergo certain investigations to address the use of these illegal drugs. Of course, state laws in recent time have undergone a lot of changes on the subject area. As of 2020, more than 40 states have actually legalized medical and or adult use cannabis. The patchwork of state laws and the conflict between them and the federal law often means that how the courts interpret a federal contractor's obligations to their employees may vary depending on the state. And where this comes up a lot is actually that testing requirement that we just talked about under the DFARS, the requirement to test your employees. In some cases, some state courts have actually held that employers must reasonably accommodate job applicants and employees who are medical marijuana users under state law. But there have been also state courts that have found the opposite, that have said that employers have no duty to accommodate job applicants or employees' use of even medical marijuana. So a lot of this really is going to be very state dependent. But the key is if you have not started thinking about how to approach those obligations in the DFARS, it's certainly time to do so now. A lot of these things are better faced when you've thought about them proactively than when you're facing an issue after the fact. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is although the DFARS requirements do not restrict employees' drug use outside of the workplace or require the employer to implement a specific drug testing plan, contractors do need to make sure that they're complying with any existing requirements that are a part of those regulations. So let's go on to the next subject of prohibitions on storage, treatment, and disposal of toxic or hazardous material. If we go to the next slide. The interesting thing about this requirement is that it's almost fully described by its name, but a little bit misleadingly. These prohibitions actually do not apply to all toxic or hazardous materials. In fact, the DFARS prohibition is only applicable to toxic and hazardous materials that are not owned by the DoD or a member of the armed forces and their dependents. The focus is, of course, on certain hazardous materials that may be owned by military members or their families. The toxic and hazardous materials that this section restricts are also not the same as those that we talked about for the hazardous warning labels, but it is exceptionally broad also. The focus here really is on materials referenced by the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, as it is commonly known, which actually, if you go to that section of CERCLA, it'll primarily cite several other environmental statutes, such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on, and actually reference the list of toxic and hazardous materials within those statutes. It is a long list, but in short, I mean, again, you're really talking about hazardous air pollutants, toxic water pollutants, and everything, that has an impact on health and physical condition of individuals. You're also talking about materials that are explosives, flammable, or have pyrotechnic nature. And, if anything is not captured within those toxic and hazardous materials lists, it's whatever the Secretary of Defense explicitly identifies as toxic and hazardous itself. If we go to the next slide. Of course, the prohibition does contain certain exceptions. In fact, the exceptions to the section are pretty extensive as well. There's actually 11 explicit exceptions, which are in DFARS 223 period 7104A. Those range in their breadth. Some of them are pretty broad. One of them specifically excludes the storage and treatment or disposal of materials for any materials that will or will have been used in connection with a DoD activity or service to be performed on a DoD installation for the benefit of DoD. Now, that was a lot of words, but essentially it excludes most things that benefit the DoD and that are used in connection with a service on a DoD installation, which is obviously a pretty big exclusion. Some of the other exceptions within that same section are much more specific. There's a provision addressing the National Defense Stockpile. There's also one for example, a temporary storage of classified materials under agreements with the Department of Energy. So there are several, in fact, that deal specifically to agreements with other agencies. But again, even in cases where a particular exception does not capture this toxic or hazardous material, the Secretary of Defense may also grant an exception if there's a particular imminent danger and those materials are essential to protect the health and safety of the public. There is a provision, though, that notes that when the Department of Defense does issue such exceptions, the storage of hazardous materials based on that imminent danger has to be temporary, and it has to cease as soon as the imminent danger no longer exists. If the DoD does provide storage or disposal for such toxic or hazardous materials, for example, those that fall under the exceptions, it may assess a charge to the contractor for such storage or disposal. The contract will typically identify that as well. So let's go on to the next section, which is actually, I think, our last section, and it is the prohibition of hexavalent chromium. Let's go forward. Now, it's important to know that there's a reason for why this specific chemical, the hexavalent chromium, is the only one that has its own section. Obviously, the reason is that it's a significant chemical and one that we want to watch out for when it comes up. In fact, for those of you who may remember the Aaron Brockovich movie, which I realize now is no longer a current reference, hexavalent chromium is actually the very chemical that was the subject of that movie and the class action that it portrays as seeking compensation for the health impact on an entire community exposed to this chemical. In short, it's a very serious chemical, and it has very serious ramifications to human health and also environmental risks. The DoD policy for that reason is to minimize any use of this anti-corrosive chemical in items that it acquires. But if we go to the next page, we'll learn that there's, of course, a waiver process for this as well. So prohibition that the DoD has, for example, does not apply to critical defense applications if there's no substitute that can meet the performance requirements, and the DoD actually has a policy which contains certain requirements for how you weigh hexavalent chromium versus substitutes to make sure that there are truly no substitutes. Unless an exception applies, though, the incorporation of hexavalent chromium in items acquired by the DoD can also be waived by a high-level officer, such as someone from the PEO's office. If we go to the next slide. But ultimately, where there is no such waiver, the DoD has a strict prohibition. Contractors, the contracting officer, for example, may not include any specification or standard in the solicitation that results in a deliverable or construction material containing more than 0.1% hexavalent chromium by weight. So essentially, your statement of work can require something that necessitates such a deliverable or material. In fact, cannot do so when there are proven substitutes that are available and they can provide acceptable performance for the government's purposes. But there are, again, some exceptions. This prohibition on hexavalent chromium won't apply to legacy systems and their related parts that already contain hexavalent chromium. So, really old jets and other technology that has had hexavalent chromium from back in the day, for example. Additional sustainment-related contracts for a system where hexavalent chromium was previously approved similarly fall into that exception. But again, even when you're facing those exceptions or reviewing a waiver request, the key really is to make sure that you're evaluating whether there are those proven substitutes that can ensure acceptable performance without the use of hexavalent chromium. On the next slide, you'll see that there are actually a similar prohibition for contractors, which similarly provides that a contractor shall not provide any deliverables or construction material that contains hexavalent chromium in such concentrations above 0.1% of hexavalent chromium. And it also requires the removal of hexavalent chromium when you're doing sustainment of any deliverable, unless, of course, any of the exceptions that we've just discussed apply. Notably, the prohibition against hexavalent chromium does not apply to things that are just a byproduct of the manufacturing processes that are required for the performance of the contract, and contractors may still request authorization for use of hexavalent chromium from contracting officers. But again, very hazardous chemical, and one to watch out for if you ever see it in a waiver request, and frankly are considering making such a waiver request. If we go to the next slide, just to wrap up, if it has not become clear yet, I watch a lot of movies, and while this one's kind of a cheat to use here because it doesn't directly deal with any of these requirements, I think it's an important one to remember, hopefully an easy one to remember. But if those of you who've seen War Dogs may recall that the way that the story ends, this is somewhat of a spoiler alert, but the way that the story ends for contractors who don't comply with DoD's requirements is often with terminations, debarments, and sometimes even prison time. In War Dogs, the contractor there submitted improper material, foreign material to the Department of Defense, which is ultimately what caused their downfall. But the DFARS requirements that we've discussed today may very well create the same level of liability, if not worse, when a contractor fails to comply with these requirements. I mean, keep in mind that these are requirements that deal with perhaps the most important aspect of any contract, the safety of the people involved and future users. So these are very material requirements, and failure to comply with any of them, whether it's the hexavalent chromium, the hazardous warning labels, or even the drug-free policies can very well result in a termination, debarment, false claims act violations, and in certain contexts, even criminal penalties. That's why it's so crucial for you to understand these requirements and to be aware of them whenever they do come up in your contract or solicitation. Hopefully this presentation helps you do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for a great presentation and for sharing your time with us today. And if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to reach out with the contact information that's on your screen now. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS. Have a good one, everyone.